There is perhaps no other sector of the Western esoteric traditions surrounded by as much controversy, debate, mystery, and polarization as the fraternal organization of Freemasonry. What is it? How did it come about? What are its aims? Further still, what are its means? How can we truly know? We will attempt to address and provide qualified information towards potential answers to these questions in this very special episode. What is Freemasonry? I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. There are many definitions, some more descriptive than others as to what Freemasonry is. Many earlier authors and scholars of Freemasonry chose quotes from well-established Freemasons to exemplify a definition, such as George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, Rudyard Kipling, Harry Houdini, Mozart, the list goes on and on. These quotes were appealed to in order to exhibit the heights to which the tenets of Freemasonry may raise a man. However, in our postmodern age, such a display appears only as apparent proof of cronyism, elitism, and the deep-reaching infiltration of the organization into all sectors of media, government, and public affairs. However, this is an extremely lazy and unreasoning reading of history, for more reasons than one can fully list, while keeping within some kind of time limit, nor deign to fully elaborate on the basis of entertaining such specious logic, and frankly, infantile credulity, while retaining a sense of dignity. However, the most obvious conclusion, when surveying the total population of Freemasons, is that Freemasonry counts more members among its numbers of relative anonymity than of prestige or prominence. It encompasses the entire cross-section of our society and embraces all walks of life. This is the essence of class and creed equality, the essence of what some might consider the egalitarian spirit. Therefore, let me state this at the outset, this episode will not be comprised of Freemasonic apologetics. When and where I do appeal to an apologetic method, it will be to state and clarify the facts. As it is said, to the disbeliever, no proof is possible. Therefore, we will come back to a definition of Masonry, as it is impossible to have any idea of what Masonry is, and isn't, without examining its history and some of its central tenets. Generally, it can be said that Freemasonry is a fraternal organization which utilizes highly stylized ritual and lectures to successively initiate, pass, and raise, as progression through the threefold degree system is referred to sequentially, candidates for admission to full participation and benefits, culminating in the rank and title of Master Mason. To be sure, the origins, history, and meaning of Masonry are as widely debated within the fraternity as without. Masons themselves have many individual theories, and to this end, there are Masonic lodges devoted to research regarding the history of the craft. This non-uniformity of Masonic historical identity is important, because it illustrates the truth of Freemasonry, that Freemasons are free to think, speak, and act as they choose, though it is admonished that their behavior not be in disharmony with Masonic tenets of fraternal amity, good character, and theism of some kind, as well as community charity. Freemasonry is meant to be a way of life, not mere philosophical speculation. It's important to note that worldwide institutional Freemasonry is decentralized. That means there is no single global headquarter. Global Freemasonry operates on amity or recognition, which in the United States typically takes the form of a panel of Grand Masters, that is, Master Masons elected to a term in the Grand Line or highest administrative Masonic body of their region, approving recognition in the form of a unanimous resolution. That said, much of the ritual workings and landmarks, as they are called, regarding the modern Masonic institution, which we discuss in this episode, will necessarily take the form of American Masonry, as worldwide there are obviously bound to be variations and exceptions. Masonic ritual varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Within the United States, for instance, the rituals approved for degrees by the Grand Lodge of North Carolina may differ in some respects from the rituals of, say, Maine. Though there is no official global central organization of the Freemasonic institution, and it remains decentralized worldwide, as we just mentioned, there are two main branches of Masonry, termed regular and continental. There are general requirements of admission to a regular Masonic body, and these are classically referred to as the Masonic landmarks. 1. That they be a man. 2. That a volume of scripture be opened in a working lodge. 3. That the discussion of religion and politics be not admitted to take place within the lodge. And perhaps most importantly, number 4, that members must believe in a higher power, some form of deity. The verbiage is a supreme being. Masonry does not require belief in a specific deity, but an atheist cannot be made a Mason in regular Masonic jurisdictions. In regular Freemasonry, this requirement is largely due to the most rarefied teachings of Freemasonry concerning the spiritual life of humankind, not merely from a symbolic or psychological point of view. In other words, secular humanism is not an adequate substitution for belief in deity. Continental Masonry, typically descended from an administrative body referred to as the Grand Orient de France, refers to Masonic jurisdictions which have done away with one or more of the aforementioned Masonic landmarks. Some other traditional Masonic requirements are that the candidate be of lawful age, 18 years or older in North Carolina and the states generally, that their admission be of their own free will and accord, rather than at the solicitation or pressure from another member, even if said solicitation be from within their family. As the saying goes, to be one, ask one. That they be of good report. Each lodge has their own parameters for this requirement, some more lenient than others, but will usually include a formal background check investigation. Particularly egregious or heinous crimes, any violent or sexual convictions, will typically raise questions concerning potential membership. As alluded to just before, Grand Lodges in the United States also vote on whether or not to recognize other Masonic state Grand Lodges. This recognition is also referred to as Amity. This can affect whether or not a Mason from one state can travel to visit a lodge in another state that has been voted as no longer recognized by their home state, for reasons which they may have considered as quote-unquote irregular. As we see, regularity is an important word and concept in Masonry, as it is the bracket under which fall generally accepted Masonic customs, according to certain Masonic traditions. These we have defined as the traditional Masonic landmarks. Lodges that operate outside of these requirements are usually unrecognized by regular Freemasonry at large. Again, there is no worldwide HQ for Masonry, but there are exemplars, or lineal ancestors. Typically, the Grand Lodge or United Grand Lodge of England for regular Masonry, and the Grand Orient de France for Continental. In particular, being considered regular Freemasonry in the States, Masonic Blue Lodges operate based on the rules and regulations as set forth by the Grand Lodge of their particular state, in accordance with the traditional Masonic landmarks. A major schism occurred when the Grand Orient de France began allowing atheists to join Masonry around 1877, causing a schism between the Grand Orient and the rest of regular Masonry, which persists to the present day. As a result, another Grand Lodge was instituted in France to supplant the Grand Orient, now known as the Grand Lodge Nationale Française, which exists in concordance or amity with the UGLE, or United Grand Lodge of England, and other regular Masonic bodies. So, all that said, we should here clarify certain distinctions of terminology and explain the various Masonic bodies. The first 3 degrees of Freemasonry are conferred as part of what is called the Blue Lodge system in the United States, also referred to as craft Masonry. The 3 degrees of craft Masonry include being initiated as an entered apprentice, being passed to the degree of fellowcraft, and finally being raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason, with the exception of the Master Mason ritual being a later addition to the degree system, apparently. However, there are 2 other mainstreams of Masonic tradition, which are called appendant or concordant bodies. These are the York Rite and Scottish Rite, which have further degrees. The York Rite typically totals 10 additional degrees in the United States, and Scottish Rite totaling in 32 degrees with an honorary or administrative 33rd degree. Upon being raised to the 3rd degree of Master Mason in craft masonry, it is typically made explicitly clear in most lodges in the United States that there is no quote-unquote higher degree in masonry than the 3rd degree of Master Mason. Therefore, for the sake of analogy, we could look at masonry as moving vertically through the first 3 degrees, and from there moving laterally in the appendant bodies, which are a series of degree trajectories, expanding and elaborating the Masonic mythos and history. However, the first 3 degrees of craft or Blue Lodge Masonry are prerequisite for admission to the appendant bodies of York Rite and Scottish Rite and any other further degrees. Therefore, all York Rite and Scottish Rite Masons are craft Masons, but not all craft Masons are York Rite or Scottish Rite Masons. There are also co-Masonic bodies that accept the admission of women, such as the Order of Amaranth and the Eastern Star worldwide. There are typically 3 main concerns within a Blue Lodge. Ritual. This includes the initiating of new candidates and their advancement through the degrees. Business, such as matters pertaining to finances, education, and voting, for instance. And charity. Masonic lodges are bastions of financial and other forms of charity within their various communities, and to a greater or lesser extent, this is uniformly true. But where does Masonry come from? Does it belong to a certain time, to a certain place or people? It's important to note that there is no unanimous consensus among scholars within nor without the fraternity as to exactly when, where, and how Freemasonry was developed. However, there are several theories which we'll be examining today. We should also note that what we can reconstruct of Masonic history does have a paper trail of extant historical evidence. However, it sort of recedes into the dark mists of time, with many Masons and scholars intuiting or supposing that it goes even further. The idea that Masonry dates back to ancient Egypt is a comparatively controversial but old one, with very little hard evidence to support it. But there are several interesting correlations, which many outspoken and prominent Masons have put forth with great enthusiasm. Slightly more plausible is the idea that the ancient forebears of modern-day Masons were the Comacene builders, descending from the architectural collegia of ancient Rome. Of course, there is another controversial, yet intriguing and highly popular theory of Freemasonry emerging from the Knights Templar. A fascinating line of investigation is the correlation of early Freemasonry and the invisible fraternity of the Rosicrucians. More along the lines of solid historical evidence, we have craft Masonry emerging out of Scotland of the Middle Ages, with most of later Masonic development of importance to modern day happening in England in the 18th century. Let's now examine these in turn, starting with the most plausible, since it's the historical trajectory that can be verified by scholarship by way of extant historical evidence. And it is the most generally accepted historical origin of Masonry, at least as far as we're able to trace it as of the current day. For many years, a majority of the Western Masonic and non-Masonic scholarly consensus traced Freemasonry's development back to England, as both the extant historical records and traditional Masonic convention pointed to the formation of the Grand Lodge and United Grand Lodge of England as the beginnings of modern Masonry. On June 24th, the feast day of St. John, an important figure in Masonry, in 1717 at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern in London, 4 autonomous Masonic lodges, a lodge being a specific, typically localized group of Masons, meeting under the authority of a master of ceremonies called a worshipful master, met and chartered a unifying or Grand Lodge of London and Westminster for the purposes of, quote, overseeing Freemasonry in London. This became known as the Premier Grand Lodge of England. 3 of these 4 lodges were comprised of what are called operative Masons. This term denotes someone who is an actual working stonemason, a tradesman. This is in contradistinction to what is called a speculative Mason, indicating one who is a member of the fraternity, participating in ritual and lodge business, yet not a tradesman in stonemasonry. By this distinction alone, we see a direct evolution out of actual medieval stonemasons' guilds, as these organizations, similar in some ways to modern labor unions, were formed by and for tradesmen in medieval Europe. There is an entire line of Masonic research popularized by the 20th century scholar Leader Scott and further brought to prominence among Masons by Joseph Fort Newton's classic The Builders, which points to the Comacene builders of the ancient Roman architectural collegia as the ancient forebears of the medieval stone guild Masons, who fled to an island on Lake Como and there preserved the ancient builders' traditions during the Middle Ages. However, in a thorough survey of Masonic history, this certainly stands out as a significant period in its transmission, but not necessarily a revelation of its origin. In 1723, Reverend James Anderson published the first constitutions of Freemasonry, widely regarded as the most significant document for modern Freemasonry, establishing its own unified, codified system of Masonic landmarks, charges, and history. This was a major stepping stone in the promulgation of Freemasonry as a broader social institution. Just a brief aside, you heard me mention the term worshipful master. I want to note that the term worshipful is archaic, like much of the language used in Masonic ritual and catechism. In our studies on this channel, we've seen how the meaning of words shift over time, taking on whatever shade of interpretation is dominant and determined by usage during certain respective periods of time. Worship archaically meant honor, rather than a groveling form of submission or exclusively religious devotion. Hence is the term retained in some legislative settings, referring to judges as honorable or worshipful. This is what the term means, honorable master. The first Grand Master was a gentleman by the name of Anthony Sayer. The Grand Master's chair passed the following year to a George Payne, followed then by philosopher and clergyman John Theophilus de Saguier. De Saguier will figure in the esoteric underpinnings of Masonic ritual and teaching further on, by way of a brother known as John Byrom. In any case, this founding of a Grand Lodge in London of 1717 created a bifurcation. There were the lodges who adhered to the newly instituted Grand Lodge system, and there were lodges who remained unaffiliated with it. So there was obviously a Masonic tradition before the Grand Lodge. These lodges were referred to as St. John's Lodges and Old Masons. The Grand Lodge of Ireland was established in 1725 and the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736. Throughout this period, visiting Irish and Scottish Masons made note of what they considered to be departures or liberties taken by the Grand Lodge of England from the traditional forms of Masonic ritual. This amplified the distinction between the Grand Lodge of England and those unaffiliated with it, and in July of 1751, Masonic representatives from 5 lodges met to form a competitor lodge called the Grand Lodge of England according to the old constitutions. This effectively split Masonry in the region into 2 distinct categories, the ancients and the moderns, with the Grand Lodge of England and its affiliated lodges falling under the moderns category. These, of course, were unofficial titles, arbitrarily or perhaps tactically contrived by the ancients. However, the terms persisted, and in 1809, the moderns of the Grand Lodge of England endeavored a rectification of their ritual in order to bring it into regularity with the ancients, as well as Scotland and Ireland, eventually signing Articles of Union, thus effectively forming what is now known as the United Grand Lodge of England. Soon thereafter, a document of landmarks called the Articles of Union were drafted, which stated in part that, quote, pure ancient Freemasonry consists of but 3 degrees, namely that of entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason, including the supreme order of the Holy Royal Arch. End quote. This implied, as historical evidence also reveals, that the Royal Arch was included or appended to the Master Mason degree. We're going to see how difficult it is to really pinpoint in what regions, what kinds of degrees were being practiced simultaneously in Masonry. What we have conclusively is from Scotland, Ireland, and England. But there is evidence of these competing titles, degrees, degree systems, all kind of weaving in and out of one another. So it's important to keep that in mind. It's not entirely black or white, and there's still much research to be done, and God willing, more evidence comes to light. Now we're going to come back to the Royal Arch, but let's stop here to consider a term we mentioned just a little earlier, the Old Constitutions. This is a significant term in considering Masonic history, as there are several extant documents referred to as the Old Constitutions or the Old Charges. These are a collection of documents outlining the history, regulations, and structure of Masonry, dating to before the time of the formation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. These documents themselves serve as historical record, yet the histories they detail are also partly legend. The most significant, being the oldest of these, are the Dowland manuscript, dating to around 1550, the Cook manuscript, dating to around 1450, and the Hollowell or Regius manuscript, dating back to around 1390. There are several other early manuscripts. Some estimates figure around 19 major charges, with somewhere around 100 extant documents in total, including records of employment by church and state. Over the course of the 14th to the 16th centuries, a history of Masonry seems to have been gradually developed and recorded along the lines of a history of old, something part fact and part legend. In general, the larger part of the extant old charges consist of a tripartite composition, typically beginning with a prayer or declaration of faith, a traditional history of the craft from antiquity, and a list of regulations for the government of lodges and behavior of its members. In many cases, an enumeration of the seven liberal arts with an emphasis on geometry is also listed. The Dowland manuscript was described by its copyist, James Dowland, as a large parchment scroll delineating the history of Masonry from its origins in the ancient past. The original document is now lost, but Dowland's handwritten copy still exists and seems to be based off of or in accordance with the earlier Cook manuscript, and includes the transmission of Masonry by way of geometry from Euclid to the Egyptians, and further on to Pythagoras, and then to, quote, Hermes the philosopher, likely Hermes Trismegistus, who was thought to be an historical personage at that time. The Cook manuscript, named after Matthew Cook, is the oldest prose manuscript and second only in age to the Regius manuscript, which takes the form of a poem. This manuscript gives somewhat of a detailed and perhaps legendary history of the craft, beginning in prehistory with a biblical account of the direct Adamite lineage, attributing the parentage of the first great masters in the arts of humankind to Lamech, his eldest son, Jabal in particular, being the first geometer and architect among humankind. His middle son, Jubal, or Tubal, was the first musician and artist who discovered the science of sound while pondering the sound of his brother Jabal's hammer blows. The youngest son, Tubal-Cain, was the first smith working in crafts of metal. It speaks at some length about the biblical lineage down to the patriarch Abraham, who taught the 7 sciences, especially geometry, to the ancient Egyptians, and to Euclid, the ancient Greek mathematician and geometer often cited as the father of geometry. The, quote, children of Israel then learning the craft of masonry from the Egyptians, which they took with them in exile, eventually building the Temple of King Solomon. This is significant in that the central allegory of much of Freemasonry revolves around the building of the Temple of Solomon. From there, the manuscript tells of how it passed to France by way of King Charles II, and then on to the British Isles by traveling saints, and how King Aethelstan became initiated in the art of masonry. The Regius manuscript, while recording much the same history, differs from the previous two in that it is an epic poem written in an exceedingly archaic form of English, Early English, which succeeded the Anglo-Saxon root of the language. The segment of Masonic history is followed by 15 articles concerning the moral behavior of Masons and the operation of work on a building site, followed by another 15, further delineating the requirements of Masonic membership and protocols for behavior between Masons. This is then followed by several poems on such subjects as the Tower of Babel, the art of geometry, the 4 crowned martyrs or early saints of Christianity, and how a Mason should behave in church. It is a sprawling and fascinating manuscript, an incredible document, particularly in coming from such an early stage. Other compelling evidence comes in the form of a very early journal entry from the 17th century English antiquarian, military officer, and alchemist, among many other things, Elias Ashmole. An extremely influential intellectual, Ashmole was an enthusiastic, to put it lightly, collector of rare and esoteric texts. Among the extant records of his life, we find a journal entry recording Ashmole's admission to the Masonic Fraternity, writing that at 4:30 p.m. on October 16th, 1646, quote, "I was made a Freemason at Warrington in Lancashire." So as we mentioned earlier, it was supposed by the records of the history of the Grand Lodge of England, as well as the origins of the old charges, being located in England, that craft masonry, such as it comes to us, was formally developed in England. However, with the work of a non-Masonic scholar, David Stevenson, we find there to be a likely antecedent Scottish origin for Freemasonry in his groundbreaking work entitled The Origins of Freemasonry. Stevenson points out, quote, "The medieval contribution of craft organization and legend provided some of the ingredients essential to the formation of Freemasonry, but the process of combining these with other ingredients did not take place until the years around 1600, and it took place in Scotland. Aspects of Renaissance thought were then spliced onto the medieval legends, along with an institutional structure based on lodges and the rituals and the secret procedure for recognition known as the Mason word." End quote. Stevenson then goes on to enumerate a list of firsts which took place historically in Scotland regarding the essentials of modern Freemasonry, many of these remaining continuous features from as early as 1599. For instance, the earliest use of the word lodge in the modern Masonic sense, the earliest examples of non-operatives, being men who were not working stonemasons, the earliest evidence connecting lodge masonry with specific ethical ideas expounded by use of symbols, the earliest references to the Mason word, and the earliest evidence of a third grade or degree. As mentioned earlier, the Master Mason degree as its own discrete ritual, rather than a mere synonymous term for fellow craft mason, was a later addition. It had been believed by many scholars, and was in fact embedded in many Masonic traditions, that this degree was created in 1720s London. With the discovery of new historical evidence in the past 25 years, such as the Airlie manuscript, as well as the more thorough attention and examination that has been given to Scottish records, such as found in certain minute books, in other words, the recorded minutes of the meetings of lodges, we find that there was already a distinct Master Mason degree in Scotland in the 1720s as well. We find in the minute books of the Lodge of Dunbarton, number 18 in Scotland, a notedly speculative lodge, quote, "At the meeting of the Lodge of Dunbarton, 29th day of January, 1726, the which day there was present John Hamilton, Grand Master, accompanied with 7 Master Masons, 6 fellows of craft, and 3 entered apprentices." End quote. The larger implication here is that even at this early date, there were at least 8 Master Masons in Scotland, as distinct from fellow craft, particularly in this lodge. The minutes of another meeting note that the Master Mason degree was conferred upon a fellow craft. There is also the important matter of Kilwinning Lodge number 0, the self-purported Mother Lodge of the world, which is to be found in Kilwinning, Scotland. However, no historical evidence sufficiently supports this claim. With this, believe it or not, very brief summary of the historical evidence of the development of modern Masonry in England and Scotland, let's move slightly forward in time to the late 18th century to discuss the formation of what we understand to be modern Masonic ritual. William Preston was a Scottish-born writer and copy editor from a fairly well-to-do family, his father being in law, and was from a young age given what we now consider to be a classical education. Preston moved to London in 1760, where his professional and Masonic careers would begin. He was initiated into a Lodge of Ancients in 1763, which then reconstituted shortly after under the Grand Lodge of England, the Moderns. This detail is of interest because Preston himself would become profoundly interested in the underlying meaning and history of speculative craft masonry. In 1765, Preston began a course of research and correspondence with many well-established Masons in England and Scotland and abroad, which lasted for about 7 years, upon the completion of which he developed a system of degree lectures. appended to the Masonic degree rituals. These lectures essentially explained the rituals of Freemasonry and elaborated a system of Masonic education according to the information he was able to gather and synthesize from his Masonic elders. Preston organized a gala event in 1772 to present his system of instruction to the brethren with the Grand Lodge, and soon after published his extremely influential work, Illustrations of Masonry, in 1772. In 1774, Preston began a series of educational presentations based on this material, having prepared 12 lectures per degree. Significantly, Preston was emphatic that Masonry must improve the moral character of a man and not merely add to his worldly book learning. I have provided a link to a free digital copy of these collected lectures in the description below this video. In brief, his Masonic instruction, gleaned by profound and broad research, comprises much of what modern Masons know of Masonic ritual, including the opening and closing exchanges describing the positions and duties of the officers, the degree lectures or segments of instruction as to the symbolism of the ritual, and several of the attendant lectures, such as the charges given at the end of each degree, including lectures on subjects such as the 7 liberal arts, and one in particular which singles out geometry. Next in our survey of modern Masonic ritual is Thomas Smith Webb, whose work was specifically foundational to American Masonic ritual and the York Rite, otherwise called the American Rite. Friend to the poet and fellow Freemason William Blake, Webb was 19 when initiated, passed, and raised a Master Mason in Keene, New Hampshire. American-born in 1771, Webb was known to be somewhat of an itinerant Masonic lecturer and extremely gifted ritualist. Soon after his entry into the Masonic Fraternity, he moved to Albany, New York to make his start in the printing business. Webb received permission to begin printing and using Preston's ritual monitor in New England Masonry. Freemasonry had by this time made its way via British-American colonists to America, beginning at St. John's Lodge, instituted on July 30th, 1733, by Provincial Grand Master Henry Price at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern on King Street, Boston, Massachusetts. Around 1730, the Grand Lodge of England began to issue charters or warrants for constitution of what they called provincial Grand Lodges in the American colonies. However, these were typically issued to individual Masons in order that they may act as Masonic emissaries in the colonies of the Grand Master. Interestingly, St. John's Lodge attests to its own history predating this formal institution, explicitly stating that, quote, contemporary accounts reveal that a Masonic lodge had met in King's Chapel, Boston, as early as the 1720s, meeting according to the old customs, end quote. Individual lodges did end up gradually forming, however, with some groups even forming rival provincial Grand Lodges. While many individual Freemasons participated in the American Revolution, the typical scholarly consensus is that Freemasonry itself remained outside of the sphere of political strife, as this is one of its landmarks. While it is true that men of all creeds, political opinions, and affiliations and other differences leave the aforementioned in the street, so to speak, upon entering into a lodge, one can't help but observe how the temporary autonomous zone of a Freemasonic lodge may have brought like-minded brethren together in bonds of fraternity, perhaps creating the sealed container within which the small fledgling seed of uniquely American national identity and character was able to root and grow to maturity. Though this is just speculation, Masons will be intimately familiar with the similarities between the governance of a Masonic lodge and the fundamental democratic nature of the American constitutional federal republic. In any event, Thomas Webb began printing an adaptation of Preston's monitor, which he entitled The Freemason's Monitor or Illustrations in Masonry, dubbed the Webb Monitor, in 1797. Webb's perhaps most significant contribution, however, was in the development of the York Rite, based on a legendary meeting of Masons in the English city of York in the 900s. It claims to have entered, quote, into England in the good King Athelstan's reign, end quote. In reality, it is comprised of several independent Masonic bodies, including the Royal Arch, Royal and Select Masters, Council of Cryptic Masons, and the Commandery of Knights Templar, totaling in 10 degrees, with each body retaining their own independent government, but falling under the general bracket of York Rite. Webb has been referred to as the father of the York Rite. In Providence, Rhode Island, around the early 1800s, Webb joined a local chapter of the Royal Arch Masons, which had evolved into its own 3-degree system by this time, and was still very important to Masonry, some considering it a second half or capitular part of the Master Mason degree. Webb helped to establish a grand chapter, serving in a position called quote-unquote High Priest. He went on to also become a founding member of the General Grand Royal Arch Chapter of the United States. Further, Webb created the ritual and ceremonial procedures for the degrees of the Order of Knights Templar, forming the administrative body, the Grand Commandery, in which he served as Deputy Grand Master until his untimely death in 1819 of a brain hemorrhage. In 1784 in the United States, a branch of Masonry exclusively for African Americans was founded by the abolitionist and community leader Prince Hall. To this day, Prince Hall Masonry is the oldest and most populated, predominantly African American fraternity in America. This leads us to an important consideration, particularly because this episode is not merely for Masons or for people just interested in the general occult, but for the public. There is extant evidence in the early annals of both Scottish and English Freemasonry of an anti-Masonic sentiment, perhaps even a furor. This is likely attributable to either rejection from the fraternity or a fear of the unknown. The archetype of dark, ominous, and clandestine rites performed by anonymous, hooded figures to the sound of somber chanting and barbarous invocations has been more or less cemented in the public imagination by the fanciful writing of uninitiated authors, newspapermen, and screenwriters. Any experienced Mason knows these to be uninformed, because depictions of Masonic rituals scarcely resemble the actual thing, outside of perhaps a group of people and a few lit candles. However, we couldn't responsibly speak of Masonic history without discussing the Morgan affair and its lasting effects both in the fraternity of Masonry and culturally. In 1826, 1 year after receiving the Royal Arch degree, though it's important to note that there is no record of him ever being initiated, passed, or raised through the degrees of craft Masonry, William Morgan was illegally released from prison by the jailer's wife under pressure from an anonymous group of men after being arrested for non-payment of loans and other petty crimes. Morgan then vanished. The events leading up to this are significant. Because of his lack of character, as well as the inability to retrieve from notoriously well-kept Masonic records any evidence of his receiving the Masonic craft degrees necessary to participate in a craft lodge, or which were requisite for the conferral of the Royal Arch degree, though he swore under oath he had received these, Morgan was denied membership in craft Masonry in upstate New York, where he was living with his family at the time. He then declared an intention to publish an expose on Masonic customs and their degree rituals. Controversy ensued in the local Masonic jurisdiction, including an attempt to set fire to the building of the newspaper which had promised to publish Morgan's manuscript. The alleged story of Morgan's disappearance is that he was placed in a boat and rowed to the middle of the Niagara River where he was drowned. A trial revealed that eyewitnesses did see Morgan being taken away by 6 men in a carriage. However, there were no eyewitnesses to the supposed drowning. His disappearance was taken as evidence of his presumed murder, which was blamed on the local Freemasons of Batavia, New York. 26 men were indicted in the case, and 6 were tried on charges of kidnapping. The defendants claimed to have driven him to the Canadian border and offered him $500 to never return. What ensued was an anti-Masonic furor which overtook the country and lasted until about the 1880s or so, with the formation of the earliest third political party in America, the Anti-Mason Party. Another charge leveled against the Masonic fraternity is its participation in a supposed organization of elite wealthy social engineers called the Illuminati. This term is historically tied to the Bavarian Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt and has unfortunately stained the reputation of Masonry. The Illuminati, founded in 1776 in Bavaria by law professor and former Jesuit Adam Weishaupt, was an organization seeking to enact the secular reformation of society by highly clandestine and manipulative means. They admonished the infiltration of nearly all sectors of society, including the schools, courts, and local governmental administration. It also particularly focused on infiltration of Freemasonry. Many members did indeed infiltrate the Masonic fraternity of their day. Early on, Weishaupt had made explicit plans to subvert the existing German Grand Lodge as a shortcut to gaining entry and prominence in Masonic circles, and extend his influence and the influence of his order throughout European esoteric circles. However, the Illuminati was never Masonic. Its rituals and structure may have been crafted after some species of Masonic model, but it was never a part of the Masonic fraternity. There is even extant historical evidence of several different Masonic lodges in virulent and explicit opposition to the organization. The organization was thankfully brought down in 1787. Further still is a claim of Satanism on the fraternity by way of what is called the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite. This is an extremely nuanced subject which I'll address in the following. The claim is made that the Scottish Rite offers degrees which are hierarchically superior to the 3 degrees of the Craft Lodge. This is simply not so. The concordant or appendant bodies are a further elaboration and exploration of the Masonic mythos, incorporating esoteric themes from every sector of the Western esoteric traditions, from Templary to Mithraism to the Osirian myth and tradition of Hermes Trismegistus and beyond. But it is not an administrative body of craft masonry. As mentioned earlier, it could be viewed more as a lateral movement rather than vertical, despite certain depictions. The Scottish Rite of Freemasonry actually comes to us from French Masonry. Like the York Rite, it is a collection of degrees and orders under the general classification of Scottish Rite, which comes from early records of Scotch Masonry, Scotch Master Mason being a degree conferred upon regular Master Masons as something distinct and at an early time. These degrees took successive numbers as indicative of a sequential numbering of degrees, being added to as the 18th century progressed in French and English Masonry, particularly in 25 degrees produced by Etienne Morin, bringing the degree rights to the colonies by way of Jamaica in 1763 and then on to North America in 1764. It was in 1801 in Charleston, South Carolina, that this collection of degrees and rights became formalized in the United States as comprising the Scottish Rite, with the formation of the Supreme Council of the United States of America. This Supreme Council exists to the present day and is the administrative body of the Scottish Rite. It has no jurisdiction over the Blue Lodge or York Rite of Masonry. In 1853, the rituals of the Scottish Rite were conferred upon former schoolteacher, Confederate commander, and expeditioner Albert Pike by another prominent American Mason, Brother Albert Mackey, author of some of the most well-respected and oft-cited Masonic references in the history of American Masonry. Pike was elected as Sovereign Grand Commander of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite and remained there until his death. It has been said of Pike's contribution to the Scottish Rite, quote, "He founded a shack and left it a palace," end quote. During his tenure, Pike rewrote the rituals of the Scottish Rite, unhesitatingly injecting the ritual trajectory with his own blend of interpretation and personal philosophy. His commentary on these is in the influential and infamous Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. In terms of esotericism, much of Pike's interpretation bears a striking resemblance to the early work, many passages almost lifted verbatim, of the 19th century French occultist Alphonse Louis Constant, or Eliphas Levi, himself also a Mason. He wrote and published the Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic to great acclaim. Pike's social commentary within Morals and Dogma, however, was almost prophetic. Perhaps the most controversial idea within this work as a whole is the mention of Lucifer. This has been leveled against him and by association Masonry as a whole as an accusation of satanic affiliation and even worship. However, during the 18th and 19th centuries, an ideological current, specifically instigated by the Theosophical Society, identified Lucifer not as Satan, but as the Latin name Lucifer implies, a light bearer, working for the enlightenment of mankind. Therefore, Lucifer was not automatically associated in occult and esoteric ideas with Satan. However, the argument of Lucifer and Satan is rendered completely moot when we address several factors. Lucifer has been interpreted in many different ways throughout the course of modern occultism. That is, occultism from the time of small o Orthodox Christian ascendancy. However, much of Lucifer's nature and origin is a confused mass. The typical conception of Lucifer is that of a fallen angel. However, if we examine the original text, where this name or word is found, a very different picture emerges. The word Lucifer comes from the Latin Vulgate translation of the Septuagint, that is, the ancient Greek translation of Hebrew scriptural texts, namely from the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 14, line 12. The Greek is written Eosphoros oproi. This is literally translated as dawnbringer of the morning, or light bearer of the morning. This is then later translated in the Latin Vulgate as Lucifer, meaning light bringer. However, the context of the entirety of the passage, which becomes incredibly clear when reading it in its entirety, is in reference to a king of Babylon. Rather than merely cherry-picking this line and interpreting it in accordance with Christian hysteria, we find that it refers to an actual kingdom and an actual king at the time of the writing. This conflation was largely instigated by early Christian writers and arguably concretized theologically into the Christian mythos by the writings of such saints as Augustine of Hippo. This is because the context of the paragraph or so in which the epithet for the king of Babylon is mentioned bears similarities to the attempted ascent in hubris and ultimate downfall of Satan in the New Testament book of Revelation. This is clearly an anachronistic rendering of this figure. The book of Isaiah was written centuries before the book of Revelation. And in the Old Testament, nowhere is Satan referred to as a fallen angel. He's more of a prosecutor in the court of God, an adversary, or an accuser. Now, perhaps controversially, I draw to your attention the book of 2 Peter. The Vulgate renders Lucifer in this book as an epithet Peter uses to refer to the Christ. Freemasonry does not teach, inculcate, allude, or recommend any such affiliation with either entities. In fact, it emphatically states the opposite, that one must constantly keep their conception of highest deity always before them, ever striving to reach its ideal. This is an explicit and constant feature of Masonry. All this is to say that, notwithstanding, Masonry on a worldwide level is an organization of people. There is no enforcement within Masonry for living by its tenets and following its teachings. There are undoubtedly, as in every single organization to have ever existed, some nefarious, malicious, and deliberately ill-intentioned human beings that entered the Masonic fraternity for public gain and or cover for clandestine operations. An example of this is in the Propaganda Due Lodge of Italian Masonry, otherwise known as P2 Lodge. The scandals which the members of this lodge perpetrated are inexcusable by any metric, and are definitively anti-Masonic, which is why this lodge was formally ousted from Masonry in Italy when its activities were brought to light. Something we seem to be losing by the minute in our modern age is the fact that the actions of a specific person or group of people cannot indict nor condemn the greater population of an entire organization. The culture and modus operandi of this lodge is not diffuse within or exemplary of Masonry as a whole. As a great Mason once said, there are Masonic problems and then there are shitty people problems. The post-Civil War era in America, as well as the advent of the Theosophical Society both in the States and its expansion to the UK, combined with the lingering aftermath of the works of Allan Kardec and Franz Anton Mesmer, set the stage for a nearly worldwide spiritualist movement. Freemasonry as an institution was primed to be a central locus for much of the great spiritualist and esoteric literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Freemasonry was the veritable seedbed for the occult outgrowth organizations, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, the Society of Rosicrucians in England, the Rite of Memphis Misraim in Italy, the Martinist Order of Papus or Papus in France, and the Ordo Templi Orientis and the Orden Golden Rosenkreuz in Germany, though among these the SRIA is the only officially Masonically recognized body. Although it must be noted that these were later expressions of a Masonic revisionist period which extended into the 18th century, particularly in France, with organizations such as Martina de Pasquale's Order of Knight Masons Elect Priests of the Universe, otherwise known as the Elu Cohen, and Jean-Baptiste Villermo's rectified Scottish Rite. These were movements which attempted to rectify what they saw as an apparent stagnation or corruption of what they considered ancient or true Masonic teachings, again attempting to interpret Masonry through their various perspective lenses, given the broad tapestry Masonry offers in its traditions. However, the symbolism of Masonry, including its concordant appendant bodies, is not entirely random, and in many respects it points in a distinctly numinous or spiritual direction by way of and in harmony with the systems and symbols of the Western esoteric traditions of antiquity. I personally am prepared to say that Freemasonry is the most convincing organization, both ritualistically and historically, when considering custodianship and transmission of the Hermetic, Platonic, alchemical, and Kabbalistic traditions of the West, though many of the later outgrowths we mentioned elaborated its esoteric significations more thoroughly and explicitly than at least modern Freemasonry either can or is willing. The Spiritualist era saw some of the most spiritually inspired Masonic literature up to that point, with classics penned such as The Meaning of Masonry by Walter Leslie Wilmshurst, Stellar Theology and Masonic Astronomy by Robert Hewitt Brown, the works of Arthur Edward Waite, a Mason who organized the production of the most well-known and best-selling deck of the tarot, the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot, and many works regarding Freemasonry penned by the exceptionally brilliant and prolific scholar and author Manly Palmer Hall. The esoteric community worldwide experienced a flourish and proliferation which cannot be overstated, and which is now returning to prominence in many present-day sectors of what has been dubbed quote-unquote esoteric Masonry, which is to say, regular Masonic brethren with a particular interest in the esoteric and spiritual meaning, interpretations, and significance of the ritual symbols, history, and teachings of Freemasonry. The post-war period of the 1940s and 50s saw a massive explosion in Masonic membership. This generation has been referred to as the Joiner generation, having adopted a spirit of community after the war, the necessary result of that being all sorts of clubs, organizations, and institutions for communal gathering, support, and service. This was a golden age of membership in Masonry, yet at the same time it was also a period when esotericism was basically washed out or buried. Other things, particularly community and fraternity, took special precedence over esoteric investigation. Masonry was, as a result, exoterified. As membership over succeeding years has waned, smaller groups of Masons have seen an uptick in younger members in very recent years. Throughout history, we see this pattern of growth and expansion past a threshold point of sustainability where an organization may lose touch with its essence, its raison d'être, followed by a contraction, in which time the spiritual hearthfire is paired, but its core is nourished, spurring further evolution and another cycle of growth in perhaps a slightly new direction. The very recent movement toward esoteric Masonry tends also to dovetail with what is called the traditional observance or TO movement, gaining popularity in Masonry at the moment. The chartering of specific lodges, which return in form and style to more traditional expressions of Masonic ritual and custom, provides exposure to earlier, somewhat more esoteric writings and interpretations, while also fostering the solemnity of environment, which is part and parcel of serious spiritual impetus. It is another amniotic space where the potential for deep esoteric contemplation and conversation may be nurtured. In part 2 of this series, we'll consider the suggestive evidence for Freemasonry's antique past and examine its symbolism under the light of the Western esoteric traditions. If you've enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanum Patreon. For the cost of a cup of coffee per month, you can help me continue to produce content such as this. Thanks for watching. See you in part 2 of What is Freemasonry? In Luke's.